Good afternoon or good morning. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF in Brussels, and it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you, our online audience, and there are quite a number of you, to this discussion around a foreign policy memo for the new US administration, a recent GMF publication. It's in some ways, I guess, traditional for policy institutions to develop these when there is a change of administration in Washington. From our GMF transatlantic perspective, I think you'll agree this is a particularly interesting year to do this exercise, but also to have this conversation. But it doesn't make the exercise any less valuable. In fact, this was a broad-based study that had many different pieces to it, 8 different authors. In fact, looking at everything from democracy to the future of NATO, China, Russia policy, tech, economic competitiveness. We can't present all of that to you, although I encourage you to read the report, and it's available on our website, of course. But we wanted to bring together 3 of the principal authors today to talk about some of the key aspects that they looked at, and to, well, both tell you about some of their key findings, but also to have a bit of a discussion about what it might mean and to open it up to all of you for comments and questions as well. I mean, I would just underscore again, I think that, yes, part of the purpose here is to try to shape policy, put new ideas into the official debate, but it's also equally valuable, I think, on both sides of the Atlantic, even globally, to have these contributions as a way of thinking about the issues themselves. And so we're very pleased to have my colleagues here today to do that. Let me just tell you who they are very, very briefly, and then we'll go right to them. Christine Berzina is Managing Director of GMF North and based in Washington. Lindsay Gorman, Managing Director and Senior Fellow for GMF Technology and based, well, also in Washington. And Andrew Small, who is Senior Transatlantic Fellow with GMF's Indo-Pacific program based in Berlin, although I think today probably in Brussels. So thanks to the 3 of you for joining. Just a quick roadmap to what we'll do. I asked them all to speak for 5 minutes or so, share some key thoughts. We'll chat a little bit, and then we'll open it up to all of you, and you can ask questions via the Q&A function online. So let me just go to you first, Christine, to talk a bit about the NATO piece, but also other things that you might want to mention to us. Christine, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian. And yes, I'm coming to you all from Washington, D.C., which I know has been a center point of attention right now on the question of transatlantic security, NATO, Ukraine. All of these are deeply important and I'd say very fraught questions, especially this week. And especially this week, as every hour by hour, we have new updates and new announcements from the administration. It is hard to track what may be coming next. I'll talk a little bit about what we laid out and what I laid out as a desirable path for the future of NATO, both given what Donald Trump and his administration laid out in the beginning, a call for strength, fairness of burden sharing and investment, and the desire to be innovative and also to take on other adversaries globally, such as China. Those are valid principles. And there's a way for the Trump administration to pursue policy on these principles that attains what it wants and also cherishes the strength that the transatlantic relationship comes with and the leadership role that NATO has. The world has been as good as it has been in the United States and in Europe in many ways because of American leadership. I personally think of this as an American swagger, a charisma that is both attractive to those who are America's friends and intimidating to America's enemies. And this cowboy approach of the United States is an approach that has allowed it to have leadership in NATO and has kept some of the worst actors across the world, the worst actors in terms of those who wish to change borders by aggression, who inflict harm on neighbors, who do not respect the rights and dignity of individuals. This America has kept those bad actors in check. And for Donald Trump and his administration to want to keep that role, to derive the same strength, prestige, admiration that so many US administrations have received, there are things that they can do in NATO And one of them is to say, yes, we're going to be in Europe and we are going to make sure that our troop presence rewards those who are doing the right thing, who are paying enough. Of course, in the last day, we have learned that we are anticipating significant defense spending cuts in DoD and that EUCOM is going to be affected by that in particular, as are the other commands that are Europe-based, CENTCOM, AFRICOM, which are based in Europe. This is going to be a challenge. We don't exactly know what it means, where these troops and where the money might go, what the cuts will mean exactly. This is a major concern. And it is perfectly possible for the administration to prioritize and reward those countries that have not only done enough on defense spending, but provide capabilities and be leaders on defense without really questioning and without providing a green light to adversaries to do what they want on the European continent. And so that was the first recommendation that I had, which is to prioritize and reward those that are doing exactly the right thing, to be that good friend, the good family member that so much of Europe really wants. There's also other things that need to be done for the future of NATO and the alliance, and that is keeping a door to NATO open for Ukraine. That does not mean letting in Ukraine tomorrow. It does not mean letting in Ukraine in a couple of years. But it does stand by the principles and that attractive force of the alliance and of the United States. I don't think those prospects are especially good right now. And yet there is a long-term value, a century-long value for the United States to not take this question off the table. There are other priorities, and that really require the cooperation of the United States and Europeans and Canada in the context of NATO for getting security right at home. And this is something that I think our populations don't quite understand, certainly not the population in the United States. When I'm in Colorado or when I'm in Washington State, the notion of Brussels and a NATO headquarters seems incredibly far. And there's a question, well, how might it actually be relevant? That's a bit different even from sitting in Washington, D.C. But wow, is it relevant? It's relevant because of the need to keep people safe at home, to stop hybrid attacks, to protect infrastructure, to make sure cables don't get cut, for railroads not to get sabotaged, for airliners not to be taken down. This requires close coordination, strategizing, and good methods to be tested, refined, intelligence to be shared on the NATO level. That is something that NATO can do and does do every day. And the more the United States understands the value of NATO for its own citizens, for its own day-to-day purposes, the better. And where do adversaries test and try out new methods for doing bad things to good people? Usually that's Europe. So the more the United States can learn from Europe, the safer the United States will be. This kind of cooperation is also incredibly important on technological developments. It's also really important on looking at terrorism and other domestic concerns. And there's so much to do here and so much the US should do here. And there's a need to step up and innovate. And for this, we can really look at the need to have much higher defense spending targets. And we've heard that loud and clear. And that is something that I both recommended, at the beginning of this year. And also we see now much higher spending, but also a significant floor. And if there is a defense spending floor, there should be consequences for not being above that floor. But those consequences should not take away from the security of the collective whole of NATO. So you don't get perks, perhaps. You don't get interesting invitations or participation in innovation hubs, for example. But it doesn't provide a green light for bad behavior across the alliance. And finally, the alliance is most useful when it's around a table together of like-minded, rich countries to set the agenda for the rest of the world. And so to what extent can the alliance also be a great place for having critical infrastructure investment pledges, cooperation on critical minerals or on energy infrastructure, energy projects? There are so many good things to do around the alliance table that have not been fleshed out yet. And that is the promise of NATO. And so I know this week feels very much like a crossroads. And a lot of the recommendations that have come before and the statements that have come before this week don't feel as relevant. But there is still time and opportunity to show the administration and for Europeans and Americans to come together and understand a path of mutual benefit, not because there is a history that we need to honor and continue for history's sake, but because doing this right and doing this together makes Europeans and Americans safer, richer, and happier in the long term.
Christine, thank you very much for sharing that. Before we turn to Lindsay, maybe I could just follow up very quickly with a kind of question to you of my own. This is a political military alliance. I mean, it's highly functional in the military side of the equation. Generally speaking, there's always things that you can do better, in not least spending more and doing more in Europe, as you say. But the political side is deeply troubled, and that's not new, but it's taken a new turn, clearly. If you were writing this piece today, you were writing it some months ago, but if you were writing it today, what could you suggest to an administration in Washington that perhaps has this philosophical disinclination to be fully supportive? What can they do to signal that, under certain conditions at least, our commitment to NATO is predictable? I mean, a lot of this is simply about what is said. Yeah. What did they say?
I think the big guns really matter. Of course, there are disputes within the alliance. Of course, as in any very large family coming together for a big meal at the holidays, there are nice parts of the conversation and there are frictions. I think everyone has experienced that. But it's really risky, it's dangerous to signal fractures out to the broader world, to signal fractures to Moscow and to Beijing. This can encourage significantly bad actions. If the aim of talking tough is to get the family to be more aligned, that aim needs to be fulfilled in a way that does not make the world a more dangerous place, and that does not feel like where we are this week. So how do you signal and not have that bad action? I think you reinforce the value of the US nuclear deterrent for the entirety of the alliance. If you make clear that there is no question to this piece, it is far easier to keep having those not very comfortable family discussions, while also not increasing the likelihood of very bad misestimations from the adversaries.
Christine, thanks. Thanks very much indeed. Lindsay, let me turn to you to talk a little bit about your piece. I mean, there's no question that sort of the technology dimension of the geopolitical discussion, but also the US foreign policy discussion in particular, transatlantic, has grown markedly. And you have a wonderful sort of title to the piece in the report, which says that the race is on. Tell us a little bit about what you found.
Thanks so much, Ian, and good to be here. I think, echoing sort of Christine's initial remarks on maybe some of the chaos and uncertainty coming out of Washington, I think it would be certainly not an overstatement to say that technology is very much at the center of some of that chaos, with Elon Musk, the oligarch in chief, or whatever we're calling him, these days really wreaking havoc in DC and taking an axe to the federal workforce. And when I laid out the strategic directions for GMF's technology program, and thinking about technology in the geopolitical context and in the context of championing democracies, there are really two prongs to it. There's always, and I think there always have been, one, making sure that democracies are governing the new technologies of the future, and that those technologies are built with democratic values, both in themselves and also in the frameworks that go around them. So kind of, doing right by democracies at home when it comes to technology. And then the second prong being contesting kind of an autocratic model of technology development. And I think those two prongs that have driven kind of the technology and geopolitical conversation for the better part of the last at least 5 years, I think maybe have missed part of the picture, which is that in order to kind of embrace this innovative culture, there's some seedy underbellies to it, perhaps. The move fast and break things approach that Silicon Valley has so pioneered and has been so successful in building has had these unintended consequences for democracy. We know that. But I think we're seeing it in Washington now really firsthand as Musk and the Doja team try to implement that kind of disruption two long-standing federal programs where I think U.S. competitiveness is at stake. I mean, just the last week, we've heard reports about firing nuclear weapons scientists, slashing the National Institutes of Health budget on biomedical innovation. And I think, these things are going to have an impact on U.S. technological competitiveness. But in my piece and for this foreign policy memo for the new administration, I laid out three trends, and I think this second Donald Trump administration does inherit a Washington and also a transatlantic relationship that's very different from the one he inherited in his first administration. The first trend is that we are in this now decisive decade of geopolitical and geotechnological competition. It's very much underway with deep implications for security, geopolitics, and democracy. And who develops and integrates and applies these advances in AI, biotechnology, quantum information, and emerging industries that will be built off them most effectively will determine which countries control the 21st century's means of production. So this is an economic question. It's a security question undergirded by rapid innovation that is an open competition. Just a few examples where in the coming months and years, we'll see a transition from AI chatbots to real-world AI applications beyond just consumers. A couple examples just from the last couple of years. In agriculture, farmers in India were piloting AI tools and saw a 21% increase using them in plant growth. Breakthroughs in quantum chip technology just in the last few months are achieving error correction that can now complete in 5 minutes the computations that would normally take the world's fastest supercomputers 10 septillion years. And in medicine, one recent study from the last year found that ChatGPT alone actually outperformed both human clinicians and human ChatGPT teams in diagnosing complex conditions. So it used to be that the human machine teams were really out in front, but actually if ChatGPT ignored the clinician's judgment, it did a better job of diagnosing patients. This is the kind of rapid technological change that I'm talking about with deep implications for democracy, for security, for geopolitics. The second trend is that autocrats aren't standing still. They're moving forward. 10 years ago, Beijing released its landmark Made in China 2025 strategy. It said, we want to transform from this low-cost manufacturing base to a high-tech superpower. It was actually based on a German Industry 4.0 plan, and it laid out 10 critical industries as well as innovation policies and competitiveness strategies to catapult Beijing into this leadership role. Now we're in 2025, and China has succeeded in many of its goals, from advanced computing and biotechnology to new energy vehicles and storage. Right now, PRC firms produce nearly 2/3 of the world's electric vehicles and more than 3/4 of electric vehicle batteries. They've implemented a record 3.5 million 5G base stations worldwide. And between the time period of 2017 and 2022, actually clinical trials for medical research doubled in the PRC. And the PRC now also holds more sequencing data on the American population than the US itself does, giving it competitive advantages in the future of biotechnology and AI. China and Russia are also increasingly cooperating and collaborating, including on advanced technologies with joint investments in biotechnology and joint projects in quantum information. The PRC is no longer a prospective threat, but an equal or near equal competitor. Third, we've built a fragile China consensus. The view on the China technology threat and the need for American innovation competitiveness in Washington is more united than it was 8 years ago. But it's a tepid consensus. It's a fragile consensus. The last 4 years, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has built a de-risking agenda around critical and emerging technologies. The EU has imposed tariffs now on electric vehicles and battery electric vehicles. But the consensus must hold, and there have been actors along the way that have been thorns in the side of recognizing the threat from the PRC. As I'm sure Andrew will talk to, there's much going on there today. But as just an example, even before the Trump era, Germany itself has been somewhat of a laggard in recognizing this threat. It finally ousted Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications firm, decided to oust that company from its 5G networks, but only on a time scale in time for the arrival of 6G. And outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz lobbied aggressively against some of the economic security measures to counter Beijing. So in the memo, I offer sort of 3 buckets of recommendations. One, we need to quickly build US and allied technology power. That includes investing in the applications of generative AI across all these emerging industries that we want democracies to win in. We need to double down on US and allied biotechnology leadership, cultivating the data that's going to drive moonshots in AI and biotech and medicine, ensuring the US lead on quantum information, and building cooperation transatlantically on that. We've got great scientists on both sides of the Atlantic. Let's commercialize those technologies. Second, we need to directly confront the PRC technology threat by upholding and trying to uphold this consensus instead of upending it, which I think we may be seeing down the road. Dealing with TikTok and autocratic apps, and building a common operating picture to understand the threat from the PRC in the technology ecosystems and technology stacks of countries around the world, from Central Asia to Serbia, to our own backyards in the US and Europe ourselves. And then third, we need to operationalize foreign policy for some of these strategic tech goals. That means getting serious about what the US Trade and Technology, US-EU Trade and Technology Council can and can't do, and leveraging it towards actually concrete outcomes and milestones, pursuing new export control regimes that account for new conceptions of dual-use technology, and I think critically, as we're seeing now, really assisting with developing Europe's own defense technology base, which as Europe, I think, now questions US involvement and the continued US security guarantee, that's very much in those discussions. So whether we can achieve these things, I think, will depend largely on political will, and who will be driving them forward is really the question of the day in this new environment. But there's a lot at stake, and we, as the title of the piece says, we really can't take our feet off the gas.
Lindsay, thank you very much. And let me remind you all again online that you can put questions into the Q&A function. I'm beginning to see some coming in, but we really encourage that, and I'll come to them in a few minutes. What you've said is actually a very good bridge to Andrew's thinking about China policy. But just before we come to that, maybe if I could just, Lindsay, to ask you about something that relates a bit to, well, what Christine was talking about earlier as well. I mean, this administration, it strikes me this administration has been unusually explicit in linking tech and regulatory issues to security policy, in the sense, but not in the sense perhaps that you would have favored. I mean, making in some sense our commitment to European security contingent on how, for example, American companies are treated in Europe, in the tech sector in particular. I mean, did you give some thought to that, or how would you react to that?
Yeah, I think I would use a word that Christine did, which is that it's dangerous. Questioning and conditioning the US commitment to NATO, an alliance that I think we'd all do well to recognize doesn't just serve Europe's interests, but serves our own here in the United States just as much. Yeah, is a dangerous game to play. And I think, I mentioned these sort of 2 prongs about the democracy in tech and the China and competition angles. And I think that first one is taking on a new character, because what's at issue, it's not just the enforcement of Europe's signature digital regulation and the frustrations that all of the US companies are clamoring on about having to comply with the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, now the EU AI Act, which has just come into force, the first parts of it in the last couple of months. But specifically, this is about Musk and the investigation that the Digital Service Act has on X. It's fining X for non-compliance of the Digital Service Act. And so I think linking those things and the kind of conflict of interest issues that are being surfaced here with this tech billionaire that has this privileged state in the U.S. federal government when it comes to something as important to our collective security and prosperity as the NATO alliance is a very dangerous game to play.
Lindsay, thank you very much. Andrew, tell us about China. We have some wonderfully provocative titles in this table of contents, but you are also, in a way, talking about China from systemic rival to systemic threat. Not even a question mark, or perhaps there should be one. I don't know. You'll tell us. What did you find? What do you suggest?
Thanks, Ian. So I will kind of run through a few of the main points from the China memo that we did. We'll also circulate, there's a longer paper that we did that was a kind of deep look at the legacy from the Biden administration's work in this area and a sort of deeper dive into some of the kind of a wide range of other areas of potential cooperation. But I'm going to summarize mostly the memo that has already gone around. And we basically looked at three main areas for this. Dealing with the second China shock and the threat, certainly a threat that it poses to our industries. Sharper steps to address the growing collaboration between China, Russia, and an axis of authoritarian partners, which do also pose a systemic threat to European security, but really to global security as well, and preparations to deter a potential PRC invasion of Taiwan. And we picked these three areas in particular because getting them right matters really vitally to the economic and security interests of both the United States and Europe. They're not cases, as is the case in some of the layers of China cooperation, where I think European cooperation is a kind of nice to have for the US that can be treated as optional. And they're also not areas where European actions on China require aligning with a US agenda that doesn't suit their interests. These were kind of picked quite carefully as areas where there's a really strong interest for both sides in getting this right. But I think it may actually be helpful to, in these kind of opening comments, just to lay out why this is the case rather than taking some of those arguments for granted, because I will say right now we're not heading into a scenario where these forms of cooperation happen, and I think that should be a real matter of concern. So first of all, the China shock. The excess capacity that PRC has now in certain industries exceeds the entire global demand pool. There are entire industrial sectors that will be wiped out in the next 2 to 3 years unless effective action is taken. And Europe in particular, and Germany kind of to the foremost, is highly exposed to this. We kind of went through the first China shock, less so in particular for some of the advanced industrial countries in Europe, the one that followed China's membership of the WTO, but that mostly hit the sort of so-called legacy industries. The second China shock is already hitting advanced sectors like automotives and the entire green tech supply chain, and the legacy sectors simultaneously like steel. And it's called a shock for a very good reason. This is coming at a speed that makes it hard for societies to transition as a result of the shock, and the hit is extremely concentrated in particular industries and geographies. And as we saw with the last time this played out on actually a less dramatic scale for in the first iteration, this comes with political costs and it comes with security costs. If we're unable to sustain a viable manufacturing base, and if our dependency on China across so many of these sectors continues to deepen. And in that sense, dealing with the shock is a matter of economic security rather than just trade. And the tools that will be required to address it go beyond the classic trade tools. It will need to include everything from cyber standards to export controls, as well as some of the trade instruments that we have still tended to use somewhat more cautiously so far, such as kind of safeguard measures, quotas, and things like this. The most effective way to do this together is pretty simple, actually. It's to sit down together, EU and US primarily, identify the sectors that matter most to our economic future and that are most at risk from Chinese non-market practices and excess capacities, and then adopt essentially an all-of-the-above approach to the measures that both sides take. Not unlike the kind of cross-sectoral negotiations that you would have on a transatlantic trade deal. kind of cross-sectoral, looking at the trade-offs we have across our respective priorities, but without the kind of political difficulties of the market opening that would be involved in something like that. The worst way of going about all of this will be to embark on a transatlantic trade war that would pretty much destroy our collective capacity to act and focus on this, and our capacity to scale collectively in some of these sectors as well, and pool our efforts. And arguably, an even more mistaken way of going about it would be to believe that there are meaningful deals that can be done with China on the trade and investment side beyond kind of some low-level purchasing agreements that would preclude our having to take these sorts of measures. We have tried this approach. The option does not meaningfully exist. We can waste more time on it, but if we don't figure out how to protect our key industries effectively, we will lose some of them in the coming years. The second area is China's cooperation with Russia and an axis of other authoritarian partners. We've done too little so far, particularly on the European side, to make life difficult, and in particular to make life unpredictable for a lot of the entities that have turned China into by far the largest enabler of the Russian war. We did achieve it somewhat in the early months after the invasion, and to some extent over the last year, the US has had an impact with financial sanctions, but the overall approach, particularly on the European side, of these kind of pinprick measures against relatively marginal actors that are involved in circumvention has basically left Beijing confident that it doesn't pay a meaningful price for what it's doing. And to the extent in the sorts of exchanges that I've had with Chinese counterparts on this, where there are real questions about why Europeans keep telling them that the war is existential and then doing so little to get in the way of the scale of Chinese support for it. We will not, of course, be able to stop the collaboration between China and Russia. It reflects a deep strategic commitment on both sides, but we can make it more painful and complicated. And that will mean going after the economic actors that actually matter on the Chinese side. Banks, the large firms with economic interests in both Europe and Russia, some of the forms of technology cooperation, and threats to cut off entire jurisdictions such as Hong Kong. The tools are in place to do all of this. I think perhaps needless to say, but it's less needless perhaps at the moment, the most damaging step of all would be to do the exact opposite. A mistaken belief that it will be possible to lure Russia away from its partnership with China. This would basically have the effect of giving Beijing the partner that it had hoped for and expected when it signed up to a lot of the agreements that it signed up to with Moscow in 2022. Basically, that you would give China an empowered, globally capable quasi-ally that will see both sides magnifying and strengthening each other's positions economically, militarily, technologically, and of course, ideologically. And there is more of a risk at the moment that with some of the steps that we're seeing that we could head in this direction. And very finally, Taiwan. There's all sorts of things that we can do that do not relate to some of the most extreme contingencies. So I wouldn't want to suggest that this is the entirety of how we would cooperate on Taiwan's future. But the critical issue, of course, has to be deterring war in the years ahead, where the risks are exceptionally high, even if one doesn't necessarily buy into 2027 timetables for PLA capabilities and it actually hitting them and this turning into decisions on action. I think there is a view from some on the US side, including some people that have gone into DoD, that essentially only hard power matters, and that since Europe can't contribute so much militarily, it can't contribute meaningfully at all. I think that's completely disconnected from how Beijing thinks about the question. The sanctions and economic landscape that China would face in the event of an invasion is something they're deeply, deeply absorbed with. And therefore, there is a significant difference in the scope for deterrence if Europe is part of the coalition that is resolved to prepare effectively and stake out some clear positions on the issue. And we kind of go into a little bit more detail in the memo on what that would involve. And no matter what the Europeans are facing from Russia, the European side cannot hide from this, not only because of the sheer scale of the economic shock that it would pose to the European economy, which exceeds anything comparable from other crises in recent decades, the financial crisis, the Ukraine invasion, when you quantify the economic scale, but because the Taiwan scenario is also increasingly assessed to be one of the contexts that is likely to cause maximally permissive conditions for Russian action in Europe as well. So the issues at stake for all of this are deeply intertwined. The overall political conditions for doing any of this, I would say, don't look optimal right now, but I think the logic behind all of this still holds. We will have to see, therefore, in the weeks and months ahead, whether we're able to get to a place that I'd say we haven't yet with the new administration of really talking through this agenda seriously, or if this whole cooperation agenda on China ends up being a hostage of everything else that's playing out in the relationship right now, which I fear.
Andrew, thank you very much. We've got a number of questions that have come in, some of them really going directly to some of the points you've already made. Actually, Andrew, if I might come to you, because there's one that really relates to something you just talked about. It's a question from Giuseppe Spatafora at the EUISS. You talked a bit about, let me paraphrase the question a little bit, talking about a reverse Nixon in China, I think pulling Russia away from China. And you talked a bit about why that was not a good or practical thing. But is it something the administration is interested in? I mean, do you think they would seek that, for better or worse?
I think for some analysts had looked at it because of the sheer implausibility of being able to do this, because of the damage it would cause, and because, I mean, of course, the Nixon context was one that came in the context of the deep Sino-Soviet split that pre-existed the steps that the US took. I think there was the sense that could some of the people who are talking about it really be serious about it? I think there was a big question mark. It has, of course, in recent weeks been talked about seriously in these terms. Now, you can look at it either as a pretext for doing some of these things that some of the people involved are not necessarily wholly convinced by. That's one analysis of why this is being talked about, because it provides a rationale for certain steps with Russia that there may be other reasons for choosing to do this, but this gives it, sort of wraps it up in some kind of a wider China-related strategic logic. I think if it is taken seriously, I think it is very clear why this will not work, and why what this will do instead is, again, reinforce the logic between China and Russia of the value of this cooperation. China has been with Russia through an extremely difficult period of time, has provided it with absolutely vital and reliable support through this. The two sides have really embedded certain forms of this cooperation with each other in ways that will not be unraveled. And so if the administration believes that this is a step that will in some way wean the Russian side away, the risk is basically, as I kind of outlined, you will give a substantially more capable partner to China, even if you are indifferent to the Russia dimension of it, as you know, maybe on some of the analysis, China is the primary threat, and therefore you're indifferent to the consequences in Europe. What you will do for PRC global capabilities, the analysis on the Chinese side is Russia is the single most important strategic partner out there. And if you're able to create conditions, including through things like sanctions relief and other things, that will make it easier for the two sides to collaborate militarily, technologically, and economically, you will further empower the Chinese kind of axis and its global position in ways that will be extremely injurious to US interests. The damage to European interests, of course, of this will be even more profound, because then the likelihood of being able to put conditions in place, essentially to have a kind of several parties supporting the rollback of the entire post-Cold War security order, the risks of that substantially increase as a result of this. And you will still have the deep Sino-Russian partnership. You will gain nothing and will create a series of risks, which the obviousness of this to me and to others, again, may suggest that that one shouldn't necessarily take the analysis seriously, but I think it still makes sense to make these arguments as clearly as possible, because I think it is a view that seems to have been surfacing again, and so we have to take it seriously.
Okay, Andrew, thank you. There are a number of questions here that go really to all of you in different ways. Maybe the next one perhaps is something for you, Lindsay, but I welcome others' thoughts on it. It's a little bit of a reprise of things you were talking about, but a quote here, tech is in the center of the chaos, from one of the people who's weighed in on the Q&A. Can you just asking to elaborate a little bit more on this dimension of the transatlantic relationship. And maybe if I could add to that, because I think it's probably in the spirit of the question, at a moment of sort of high ideology on both sides of the Atlantic around these issues, how do you focus on the objective analysis and practical steps?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, exactly as you put it, high ideology, and not just high ideology, but real points of contention that, have existed previously, but now have been brought to the forefront and really made the center of the transatlantic tech relationship. And I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about potentially conditioning U.S. support for NATO on non-enforcement of key European legislation. But before, I think the last week with JD Vance in Europe, before he was at the Munich Security Conference, where he said the biggest threat to Europe is from within, and not from China and Russia. And I think he did mean there these kind of ideological attitudes, what he and the Trump world see as censorship and suppression of conservative or alternative viewpoints, that is actually the bigger threat than our autocratic rivals in China and Russia. But before he went to the Munich Security Conference and said that, he was at the AI Action Summit earlier in the week in Paris, where he made no less of a splash. He praised the deregulatory flavor of the summit, and really pointed a finger at European regulation, saying that there's no way for Europe to essentially compete, that this should be about AI opportunity and not AI regulation. And I think this is, there's always been this tension of Europe as the regulator and America as the innovator, to put it in very blunt and overly simplistic terms. And it's not only that those views are getting more entrenched, but actually that the Trump administration is making this attitude, this perspective on deregulation, but also the promotion and the allowance of these viewpoints, and really picking the bone of what they see as censorship on social media platforms, on technology platforms, making that really the focal point of many transatlantic conversations. At the same time, I think have been encouraged to see that even as many around Trump have folded and sort of capitulated on many values, it seems, and are staying quiet. It doesn't seem like that's the direction that Europe is going on some of the technology legislation that it's championed and worked hard to build. So I think that will be a sticking point, and maybe not in a bad way. And I think what Europe can do, and what we as GMF can also do, is try to draw some of these ties amongst actors in the U.S. that I think the MAGA, the Trump world crowd is probably lost on this point, that and it's probably best argument that a certain amount of regulation actually promotes innovation and makes these systems safe. That's kind of the message that we've heard, including from von der Leyen at the AI Action Summit. I don't know if that argument is really going to resonate. So I think it's about, again, these sort of tangible, concrete ideas. Can we build public AI infrastructure that advances innovation, advances AI opportunity, but also has some guardrails built in, even if those guardrails are not front and center? And then even in absent US AI leadership, when it comes to regulation, when it comes to AI safety, I do think that this work will continue, even though we've just got an announcement this week about gutting the US AI Safety Institute. There are other AI safety institutes around the world. There are other attempts to put guardrails on new technologies and develop them in the public interest. So I do think those will continue, and maybe it's working with US actors outside of the federal government who are committed to those objectives too.
Okay. Thank you. Christine, maybe for you, but maybe for others as well, and feel free, of course, to comment on other things that you've heard, Christine. There's a question, actually, it's more than one, that relates to this point of fantastic conversation. People appreciate it, all very sensible. How do you bring this to publics, especially in Europe, where there is a mood of panic, not just in political circles, but indeed in the wider public, about some of what's happening in recent weeks? Some thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and thank you for the questions. And I really appreciate the questions because they're coming from our viewers and listeners here that are about also what GMF is doing and reach and impact, because I think that is incredibly important. And so as we look at that, what is our role here at GMF as individual analysts, and also what is the role of everyone who cared enough to actually log in today and listen to this? And I think the point is that actually we all very much do have a voice. And the strategy feels of the Trump administration right now and pushing out honestly, very shocking policies across many, many areas of policy. The collective effect of that has been to, in many ways, overwhelm publics, citizens. And there is a high degree of emotion and anxiety, but so many things to be anxious about that organizing responses has frankly not happened. And so, what GMF does is, of course, we're talking to you, and you are the ones who are choosing to be here with us today. But this is not a fire drill. And communicating the fact that this is not a fire drill, that there are indeed very high stakes to the actions that the United States is doing, and very high stakes in the responses that Europeans will be taking. That is incredibly important. And so we talk, of course, to our interlocutors here in Washington and all of the capitals to make sure that that is clear and the significance and correct paths and our individual viewpoints are ones that we communicate. But there is so much responsibility to get the word out, not only in capitals where most of us sit day to day, but across the countries that we live in. And the questions we're getting are also from across the transatlantic space. And so, what else is happening in the US in terms of responses and actions and I've been speaking to lots of Trump voters who are from diaspora communities who care a tremendous amount about the transatlantic security relationship and are incredibly upset. And these are people who, Lindsay, you just said the MAGA camp. I think if you think about the MAGA camp as voters, they're also not a monolith and have opinions on parts of the agenda that they're in favor of and other parts that they are not. And what would be a necessary next step is again to be vocal, to shake off the feeling of overwhelmed, perhaps passivity that comes, and to be vocal to Congress and in the public about the unacceptability to many of shaking the transatlantic relationship and the risks of making the world far more dangerous. And this is something that I think comes through in this conversation, are the very high stakes of what, if the next few months don't bring back the stakes into an honest part of the conversation, things can be potentially even worse. So I think that is, what is to be done and who is to talk. That is both us here with the things that we write and the events that we hold and participate in and the meetings that we have, but also every person who has logged into this meeting who cares enough about these issues to have a say on this. And it is something that has deep implications across the transatlantic alliance. And I think we're going to see much more on this. But again, let's move away from the fact that, of course, this is shocking and upsetting for many people. And yet there's something to do about it.
Andrew, Lindsay, I mean, you have thoughts on this question of, how you bring some of these points, or just in general, an objective debate about approaches around these issues in a transatlantic setting. How can we insert more of that into this situation, the environment at the moment, which is not putting a premium on objective analysis necessarily in many quarters. Thoughts on that? Please, Lindsay, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is holding folks' feet to the fire, holding our elected representatives' feet to the fire. I mean, on one issue that I've followed and covered for, the last half decade now, the issue of what to do about TikTok, it's been incredibly frustrating to see lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who passed a decent law to remove the PRC influence tie from the very popular social media app TikTok, just sort of stand silent as that law goes not enforced, and as the literal Department of Justice reportedly sends letters to Apple and Google inviting them not to comply with the law, which they subsequently did. And I think part of it is the information overload. That it's and just there are just so many things, who could care about this little thing about TikTok when the Ukraine war is being decided without Ukraine at the table. But I think there are many issues of this. And part of it is calling your representative and saying, hey, you championed this bill. What happened? Why are you saying nothing as it's completely flouted? Because I do think representatives respond, especially at phone calls. If their inbox and their voicemail box is totally overloaded, they do pay attention. I worked as a staffer in the Senate, and we did pay attention to those things. But then I think sort of the other part of your question, Ian, I don't know that I've totally given up hope on making the case in sort of discrete areas to policymakers, in the Trump administration, to transatlantic policymakers, where there's even the smallest potential of getting some of the right ideas through. And I think that's especially live debate on a lot of these China and China tech issues, where many of Trump's key national security advisors, have had sort of a hawkish stance on China. Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, his national security advisor, and there have always been these sort of competitive elements within the first Trump administration, and definitely in this one, to make these arguments too that actually we're going to lose this technological contest, this economic contest with the PRC if we don't take some concrete steps today. Do I think that DEI is going back on the agenda? Absolutely not. But is there a piece of AI opportunity that can be carved out and done in a smarter way? I think that's maybe more within the realm of possibility. And can we do that in some way with some of our transatlantic partners? Maybe. Difficult, but maybe. So I think there is still a role to press, in a language that is maybe different from we used just a couple months ago, and to create some of these concrete, tangible ideas that could appeal to both sides, even in a very tough climate.
Okay, I mean, there are a lot of questions here. Some of the ground we've covered already. There's some specific ones. Maybe for you, Christine, there's a question about, to the extent to which Romania, first NATO country to cancel restart an election because of Russian hybrid warfare, is that a warning for other allies? Or others are going to weigh into this. And of course, Russia is not the only malign actor in that kind of space.
So this, of course, was a core question within J.D. Vance's Munich speech last week. The question of who has power in democracies, and is it the people or is it the courts? And in many ways, I think we're in a crisis of power in our democratic systems. And again, as Lindsay, you were just saying, and as we all see, the power rests with voters, with people, as long as people are brave enough to step up and vote. I think that the issue we saw in Romania is not the first question of interference in democracies and what to do about it, but is the first one we have seen to have overturned an election. I think predictability, clarity, scale is incredibly important, and we haven't quite figured out exactly the right ways of addressing these threats and addressing the responses. It is messy, and it's making us much more vulnerable, both internally between each other, but also with the adversaries, because it is not clear what consequences are. And clarity, I think, to deter action is profoundly important. And so what do we need? We certainly need bravery. Right. So again, not only is the MAGA voter base not a monolith, and the NATO members are not a monolith, but I think that the quiet and lack of willingness to make a scene is probably the most dangerous thing of all the dangerous things we've been talking about here today. Because the more open and brave both people who are in the administration, in elected office, and also voters, media are, to take on the issues they say, the clearer we will become. And the more I think the adversaries will see that there isn't an opportunity and there isn't a notion of weakness across the alliance and across the US and Europe. And that, again, is not just the four of us on the screen and not simply a question of the White House does, but really what absolutely everybody does.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time, but and I know there are a lot of questions here, but maybe I could come at least to another one. Linking, in a sense, well, again, to paraphrase a bit, it's from Sunny Pan, wondering whether the recent comments about President Zelensky and the situation in Ukraine from the Trump administration, from Trump himself, what effect on Taiwan, on the Taiwanese situation? Could you imagine a kind of similar thing happening in the Taiwanese case that would be very disruptive to U.S. transatlantic interests in the region?
Yeah, I mean that's obviously that's obviously the fear. And I mean Taiwan is of course the most exposed. And we know the positions that President Trump has taken on Taiwan, which have been, as with some other issues on China policy, not necessarily entirely in line with what I would consider to be the overwhelming consensus, even of the people in his administration, Republicans in Congress, public opinion. I mean, on some of this, he is an outlier, and I think this goes to Lindsay's point earlier. I mean, there's China's zone is a real litmus test for this. Taiwan, probably most importantly of all, we're seeing on some of these issues already the kind of clash between what you would call the wide consensus that is bipartisan, like crosses the administration, and some of the things that he and some others may want to do. And that's going to be a real test for how some of these things come out. Now, on Taiwan specifically, I think there have been people who have made the arguments to him that if you're going to be doing this kind of peace through strength, and you're going to need to show a kind of credible deterrent posture when it comes to this and to take this seriously. We've seen a slightly different logic laid out by the defense secretary and others in making this argument about concentrating resources around Taiwan. There are certainly a lot of people in DoD now who are going in who believe this. I think there's still this big question mark for Trump personally, and it would be the president's decision ultimately on this, about what he sees as US responsibilities and commitments vis-a-vis Taiwan. Obviously a very different view from President Biden, but presidents before him as well. And I think there's a lot of people who are trying to figure out how to make sure that the right case sticks, but there will be understandable nervousness about where this comes out, and some messy signaling as we see with the statements on semiconductors and I think the frustration about being boxed in, because I think for those who've privately briefed him on some of this out before going into the second term, I think the semiconductors argument resonated because that's of course the huge economic shock and what the position that China would be in if it were able to seize the island. That was not an argument that's persuasive on the basis of democracy or security, but that was compelling. But of course, that creates its own frustration, as you see with the semiconductor tariffs and other things. So I think that's the concern, and this is the argument that's been made repeatedly on the European side, is China is watching. China is watching what plays out in Ukraine. There's a reason that Taiwan has been supportive. There's a reason that Korea has been supportive. There's a reason Japan has been supportive. This is understood to have ripple effects in the Indo-Pacific as well. They supported it for the intrinsic reasons, but also because these are deeply intertwined questions. So the stance taken on Zelensky in Ukraine, of course, has concerning resonance in a Taiwanese context as well. And I think going back to Christine's point and Lindsay's point, this is where it will be required for a lot of people to stand up in the administration and make this case. Otherwise, there will be extremely damaging implications, not just for, again, some of the interests in Europe. There may be people that are willing to write off for whatever reasons. If this is Asia too, that's a very significant hit to US global posture for some quite poorly thought through reasons.
Okay. Andrew, thank you. Let me thank the three of you, Christine, Lindsay, Andrew, for this. It's really been an extraordinary conversation, and I encourage you all who've been listening to read the report and to share it. I had a question of my own, which I am not going to pose because we're actually out of time, which went to the question of, this was written some months ago. If you were to do it again now, what would you do differently? I'm not going to ask that, but we can all ponder that one, and I'm sure we can have our own answers to that question. Let me also just thank, in addition to our speakers and to all the authors of the report, also our strategic convening team and William Stewart Webb for putting this together. Thank you all for joining us very much. Please do read the report and watch other things we're doing in this space, and there are a lot of them. And we look forward to having you with us again soon.